This is Green Street, the environmental health show, greenstreetnews.org. Patti and Doug Wood and our network of experts with your weekly update on what is going on in the world of environmental health and what you need to know to protect yourself and your family in this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back. 1 in 8. Those are your chances, if you're a woman, of being diagnosed with breast cancer sometime during your life. 1 in 8. This year, 321,000 women will get the news from their doctor, and more than 42,000 will die from the disease. These statistics are not all that different from 1982, when Susan B. Komen was founded, and the pink ribbon marches and rallies began in earnest. But despite more than 40 years of marching for the cure, shopping for the cure, golfing for the cure, and doing whatever else for the cure, women continue to be diagnosed in huge numbers. Today on Green Street, you'll meet a remarkable woman who was fed up with research taking so long and who decided, along with a group of her fellow cancer patients, to do something about it. It's a very positive story, and you won't want to miss it. But first, some of the headlines that made their way to our desks this week. Patti, what do you got for us?
2 important articles. One is the EPA pollution rules no longer count lives. One of the most important ways the U.S. government protects public health is by regulating pollution so that companies' activities don't harm people's health or the environment. The Environmental Protection Agency sets and enforces limits on air, water, and soil pollution under laws like the Clean Air Act.
What else would you count besides how many people are affected?
Well, when the EPA evaluates a new regulation, it typically uses a cost-benefit analysis to compare costs.
Here we go.
Which are what companies and sometimes consumers will have to spend to comply. For example, upgrading equipment, changing their processes, and so on.
Yeah.
And then there's the benefits. How much better off the public will be if pollution goes down, including fewer illnesses, fewer hospital visits, less lost work time, and lives saved. To do this, economists estimate the value of reduced health risks in dollar terms, including a widely used figure called the value of a statistical life. This is essentially the amount society is willing to pay for reductions in mortality risk and has ranged from $6.8 million under the Bush administration to roughly $9.8 million under Biden. But last week, the EPA announced a big change.
Gee, I wonder what this could be.
Okay, for some major air pollutants, such as fine particles and ozone, cost-benefit analysis will no longer include the dollar value of health benefits. This tilts the math in favor of corporate interests. Pollution rules now appear far more costly, making it easier for companies to push for weaker protections.
And we're not even counting the real, true downstream costs of some of these
Oh, no,
things.
we're not looking at the whole picture here.
Because the companies can claim, oh, that's not our product that caused that problem, your cancer. But if you look at, cancer treatments over, 10 years while somebody's got cancer, back and forth to the hospital and all kinds of drugs and hospital stays, it's a tremendous amount of money, but we're not counting even that, and now we're going to count less than that.
Right. We always thought that the cost-benefit analysis was bad. Now it's really bad.
Now it's really bad.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I have an article here about the Supreme Court, which recently said that it will decide whether tens of thousands of people who claim that the pesticide known as Roundup caused their cancer will have a day in court, or whether a federal law that regulates pesticide labeling will effectively block their cases from moving forward. The decision by the Supreme Court to hear the case follows a $1.25 million verdict in favor of John Durnell, who sued Monsanto in Missouri State Court in 2019, alleging that he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after being exposed to Roundup. Monsanto, which was bought by Bayer Chemical back in 2018, has faced more than 100,000 similar claims across the country. The EPA, which does not actually test any products but relies on manufacturers' data, has repeatedly stated that based on the information provided by Monsanto, glyphosate does not cause cancer and has declined to require warnings on Roundup labels. But in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a
IARC
branch of the World Health Organization.
Correct. In Lyon, France.
Right. Classified glyphosate as an agent that is probably carcinogenic to humans. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people assume that the EPA does some independent testing of those pesticides, but
they
clearly
do
it
not.
doesn't.
And in fact, in 60 days or less, people will be in those big box stores buying their gallon container of Roundup
Well,
which contains glyphosate as the active ingredient.
So it turns out that they're actually replacing glyphosate in some of their consumer products, and they're replacing. You might recognize some of this. They're replacing with chemicals including diquat dibromide. Here's one I love: Phaluzapop P butyl.
Phaluzapop P?
Phaluzapop P butyl. The P is capitalized, if it makes a difference. Triclopyr and Imazapic. I never heard.
Right.
What are these chemicals they're coming up with? And they've got to be pretty dangerous.
We'll go research them quickly.
Cow.
It's easy to find out what they are and what their health effects are.
Well, good. You can go do that.
Okay.
All right. What else you got?
Well, there was a secret panel to question climate science, and a judge found that it was unlawful.
This is in the United States?
Mm-hmm. The researchers produced a report that was central in a Trump administration effort to stop regulating climate pollution. New York Times. A federal judge on Friday ruled the Energy Department violated the law when Secretary Chris Wright handpicked 5 researchers who reject the scientific consensus on climate change to work in secret on a sweeping government report on global warming.
And they're not allowed to do that, I guess.
The
right?
Energy Department issued the report, which downplayed the dangers of warming without having held any public meetings or made records available to the public. Lee Zeldin, the administrator of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency,
our favorite guy,
then cited the report to justify a plan to repeal the endangerment finding. This is a landmark scientific determination that serves as the legal foundation for regulating climate pollution. But the Federal Advisory Committee Act of 1972 does not allow agencies to recruit or rely on secret groups for the purposes of policy making. Judge William Young of the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts said that the Energy Department did not deny that it had failed to hold open meetings or assemble a balance of viewpoints as the law requires when it created the panel known as the Climate Working Group. Quote, "These violations are now established as a matter of law," said Judge Young, who was nominated to the bench by Ronald Reagan. The Climate Working Group was, in fact, a federal advisory committee designed to inform policy and not, as the Energy Department claimed, merely assembled to exchange facts or information.
Well, Patti, if they put together a panel of people who actually knew what was going on in a balanced view, they wouldn't be able to come up with the report they want.
Of course.
So this is, they decide what they want. We need this report.
Right.
And they put together this group that will give them the report they want.
Right. So this was really unbelievable for the court to issue this order, making it clear that it was a legal violation, right? It was really. So the agency disbanded the Climate Working Group shortly after environmental groups sued and argued that having done so, any legal concerns were rendered moot. And the court disagreed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
they're trying to pretend nothing happened. We're just going to go back and nothing ever happened.
So thousands of pages of emails and internal documents made public under the judge's order show that the group had worked diligently to keep its existence shielded and met in secret more than a dozen times.
Well, I suppose there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But, especially in these days.
Yeah.
All right. Well, people in the UK are being urged to avoid eating locally produced eggs near a chemical plant after traces of a potentially carcinogenic substance were found.
Eggs?
Eggs. According to the investigators, a chemical known as PFOA.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
Here we go.
Yep.
Used in it's one of those forever chemicals, right? Used in manufacturing processes and released into the air between 1950 and 2012.
1950?
1950.
And 2012?
Yeah, we're talking about 62 years.
Right.
Came from a chemical plant in Lancashire, now run by AGC Chemicals Europe Limited, which makes a wide array of high-performance fluorochemicals, fluoropolymers, and other materials used in construction, automotive, electronics, and energy industries. Scientists collected egg samples from chicken farms located within 1 kilometer of the site. Testing confirmed that the levels of the carcinogenic chemical were elevated and exceeded the recommended safe weekly rate.
Wait a second. There's a weekly rate of PFOA that you can consume?
This is the British Food Standards Agency, which I guess is like our EPA.
There's no rate.
Patty, I'm reporting, literally reporting the news. The British Food Standards Agency warned that eating just one of these eggs per week could push someone over the safe exposure limit. In response, the local city council suggested that eggs from birds in a 1 kilometer radius area should probably not enter the food supply chain.
At all.
You think?
Wait a second. Exposure limits?
They have a weekly exposure limit.
Yeah, but I know.
PFAS.
Is it parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion, parts per quadrillion? Should be parts per quadrillion.
Doesn't say.
Doesn't say.
Apparently, the contamination came from years of dumping the chemical where it got carried away by rodents and birds and ended up in the dirt where the chickens were scratching around. Remember, these are the forever chemicals that stick around in our environment for forever, right. Which is why they're picking up chemicals that could have been dumped in the 60s and the 70s. So the contamination will go on forever, and the people who own those farms are going to have to stop raising chickens and maybe move away. All the while, AGC Chemical Company, which had a profit of over $3 billion a year, continues on their merry way. So there you go. People can't eat the eggs, but at least the company and its stockholders can make money.
We don't have a
weekly limit.
No. I've never heard of our agencies, like the FDA, putting an exposure limit on an egg.
No. I haven't heard of that either, but who knows? Maybe it's right around the corner.
Yeah, but it should be exposure limits on everything.
I realize
on everything we eat, because it's contaminating basically everything.
All right, that's the news of the week. We'll be back in a bit.
Wow, okay.
Breast cancer has been a scourge for women around the world for generations. Everyone knows someone who's been affected, as a patient, a parent, a friend, or a coworker. And while billions of dollars have been spent working to find a cure for breast cancer, that cure has proven to be elusive. For one thing, there are different types of breast cancer, and many factors can trigger the onset of disease. Yes, women who have inherited the BRCA1 or BRCA2 genes have an increased risk, but it's generally accepted that most breast cancers are not due to inherited genes. Instead, it's the environment that seems to be the biggest factor.
Some environmental exposures are pretty obvious. Women who smoke and women who regularly drink alcohol have an increased risk. But at this point in the discussion of causes of breast cancer, there is a fork in the road. The corporate pink ribbon campaigns claim that more research is needed to identify any other types of environmental factors that could increase a woman's risk of breast cancer. On the other hand, independent researchers have identified chemicals in everyday products as possible culprits in increasing risk.
Chemicals that make fragrances linger in the air, or act as preservatives in makeup, or make plastic bottles soft and pliable, have all been found to increase the risk of breast cancer. But those chemicals are essential to the personal care products industry. In many cases, the same companies that sponsor the Pink Ribbon breast cancer awareness campaigns every October. So, when a lawyer from San Francisco developed breast cancer, she wanted to know why.
I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 52, and I got this diagnosis, and like many other people, I knew very little about breast cancer, although my mother had breast cancer. And I thought it was, I thought it meant I was going to die, because I remember the stories from, when you had friends in high school and college whose mothers had breast cancer. That was often what happened.
That's Polly Marshall, an attorney formerly doing affordable housing and community development work in San Francisco, and now the executive director of Breast Cancer Over Time, a nonprofit organization that's not waiting for more corporate science, but instead organizing breast cancer survivors to take an active part in pushing that research forward.
I started going, to the support group at my local hospital while I figured out what kind of treatment I was going to need. And ultimately, I had 3 lumpectomy type surgeries, chemotherapy for 4 months, and radiation therapy. And then I took all the possible combinations of anti-hormonal drugs, tamoxifen, and various aromatase inhibitors for the requisite 9 to 10 years. But what happened was our support group was just so important to me. And there was a cohort of us who kind of went through, we were newly diagnosed together, and we went through all our different types of treatment. And when we finished our treatment, we kept meeting, and we felt like, whoa, we have just finished doing all this work to save our own lives. And our next thought was our kids. And we just felt like, what can we do so that our daughters and their whole generation and our sons don't have to go through this? You know, we periodically in this group had always asked ourselves, why do we think we got breast cancer? People came up with these theories like, oh, it's because I'm too stressed at my job. That was the most common one. And then there was, I took birth control pills starting when I was, 16 and a half. Or we had a lot of people with this from the Central Valley. I rode my bike behind the DDT spraying truck in the middle of the summer because it was cool spray. I did hormone replacement therapy, or I didn't breastfeed my children, or I didn't breastfeed them long enough, or I didn't have children, or, it's all these things that we blamed ourselves for until we started looking around and saying, what about this milieu of toxic and chemical exposures that we're all exposed to and that we know, genetic propensities or not, and none of us had any apparent genetic predispositions. We just knew that milieu that we had grown up in had in some way helped bring us each to our cancer diagnosis.
Polly Marshall's support group decided they wanted to focus their efforts on kids. They didn't want their kids to have to go through the same ordeal they had just been through. They knew that there were what scientists called windows of vulnerability, particular stages during our lives when cells are rapidly developing and we are particularly at risk for all kinds of hormonal mischief.
The windows of vulnerability, are when breasts are growing or changing. And so it's in utero, it's puberty, it's pregnancy, it's breastfeeding, and menopause. So there's been a lot of focused attention, and that's why we were all so concerned about the personal care products, because we all had kids that were, those ages in puberty, adolescence, and we were tired of, fighting with them without having the scientific information.
Science is expensive. There are limited budgets, and there are those who may not want certain kinds of studies to be performed at all. Most of the major research centers in the U.S. are heavily funded by private industry, and whether by design or not, studies about chemicals in personal care products and their links to breast cancer are hard to come by. But there are some.
So meanwhile, when I had my third surgery, my surgeon asked me if I would donate breast cells from my non-involved breast for research into breast cancer, what causes breast cancer. And I did that. And a couple years later, I went back to him and said, what did you use those cells for? And he said, we just published this study. We exposed those cells, we cultured them and exposed them to BPA. And we found that BPA attaches to estrogen receptors and it interferes with tamoxifen. And tamoxifen is a drug women take when they're premenopausal if they have hormone-positive breast cancer, which attaches to estrogen receptors in breast cells and keeps the estrogen from attaching and stimulating the cells in ways that can promote breast cancer. Most breast cancer research is done with either cancer cell lines or rodent, rats and mice cells. And all the human studies are really based on correlations. Like, these people were exposed to this hazard, and then 40 years later, they got cancer. And we're not willing to wait around for correlations to tell us how we can protect our children.
A teenager today will be in their late 50s in 40 years, so Polly's reluctance to wait for correlation studies is understandable. But then she met a researcher who told her she was looking to do a different kind of study.
So she told us that what they need for their research more than anything were healthy cells from different kinds of women, whether they're premenopausal, postmenopausal, but healthy cells from women who've never had cancer. And so we looked around and we said, we can do this. The same support group of people who, we're now 2-3 years out from our own diagnosis and active treatment. That's how we kind of developed this study. I mean, you can't take healthy young women and give them toxic stuff and then see what happens. Thank goodness you can't do that in this day and age. But we figured out this sort of a healthy intervention where we invited people to join our study. They filled out questionnaires with everything they used. It was a real education to me of what people put on their body, in their body, their hair, their nails. But at any rate, people filled in these questionnaires with, all 39 things that they use. And then we, the breast cancer survivors, all volunteers, looked it all up. And we used the Environmental Working Group's Skin Deep database. So we selected these volunteers who were already using the bad stuff that was labeled as carcinogenic or was a hormone disruptor. And we asked them to give us breast cells and urine samples and blood samples. So they came into a doctor's office and did all that. And then we gave them a kit full of, healthy cosmetics, which were basically, again, ones that we had to look everything up. But basically, the rule was no parabens and no phthalates. And we quickly learned that you can look up all the ingredients in the world and you'll never see phthalates because they're hidden in fragrance. And they don't have an obligation to disclose what's in fragrance.
So, a group of women who had been using products sold in virtually every drugstore and supermarket in America, and which contained chemicals linked to an increased risk of breast cancer, gave samples of their blood, urine, and breast cells to be tested. And then they switched to products that didn't contain any of those chemicals.
And so they used the healthy cosmetics for 28 days, which was, average length of a menstrual cycle. So we were controlling for the natural flow of estrogen in the body. And then they came back and they gave us breast cells and urine and blood again. And each time we tested the urine, to see what the parabens and phthalates there. And we found that at the end of the 28 days, the levels of parabens and phthalates had plummeted. And so that showed us that people were complying with the protocol. And we had controls who kept using their regular products. And at the very end of the 28 days, after they'd given their second set of samples, they got the bag of cosmetics to take home. We also showed people the reports that we had run and what products caused them to qualify for our study. But so it was very innovative because it was a healthy intervention. And the most dubious thing was asking the controls to keep using their regular products for 28 days, which, again, if you've had a teenage girl and told her to stop using something, you're not very successful at that. So there's a lot of people out there using that stuff.
The data was collected and the samples from the group of women were analyzed, and the results were clear. Stopping the use of products containing parabens and phthalates dramatically altered the body chemistry of the women in the study, significantly lowering the amount of these troublesome chemicals in their bodies.
We finally published, and what it showed was that when you have this healthy intervention and you take away the parabens and phthalates in personal care products, that somebody uses. And these were people who used something with those in them at least once a day, every day of the week. And we found that various cellular features that are associated with breast cancer risk changed in the people who changed their products. I mean, it was things like when cells mutate for some reason, when the DNA has a mutation, the cells will either try to repair the DNA, or if they can't do that, they destroy themselves. It's called apoptosis. And we found that the cells at the beginning, before the intervention, didn't repair themselves so much, nor did they destroy themselves as much.
Thousands of products that contain chemicals known to interfere with normal body development are sitting on the shelves of drugstores and supermarkets around the world, just waiting for unsuspecting women or young girls to come along and pick them up. Some manufacturers even use words like natural to make their products seem safe, but these products are anything but natural. So what's a mother or daughter to do? Since the power and influence of the chemical industry in Washington is unrivaled and the government doesn't seem interested in protecting women from chemicals known to disrupt normal development and cause breast cancer and other diseases, what advice does Polly Marshall have?
The first thing is pay attention to what you're putting on your body. Look up the ingredients, because whatever you put on your body, it gets absorbed through your skin. If it's something you spray on your body, you inhale it. That's why the fragrances have this stuff, so that you will smell it when you're inhaling it. When you inhale it, it goes to your brain. So, it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So anything you put on your body, you should be looking at what's in it. And there's so many ways to do it. I mean, Environmental Working Group has this wonderful Skin Deep database. It's an app on your phone you can get called Healthy Living. You can scan what's in the products, and up pops, this is the ingredients, this is how hazardous they are. Or you can look at that database in a different way, like, give me the list of all the best ones, the least dangerous, and you can look through 20 shampoos, and pick out the one you want. The second thing I would say is resist the advertising, resist the peer pressure. I'm going to try to get an article in like 17 Magazine and Teen Vogue, even though I know their advertisers are not going to be very receptive to what we're doing. The other thing is that there's green companies now. Every day, practically, there's new companies opening, and be open and receptive to that. You can use something that somebody has made with care for you. And it would be great if the cleaner products were less expensive, and we're told that the more people who use them, the more the price will be able to come down, and we'll be able to reach into the pockets where this stuff isn't as available.
Polly Marshall, Executive Director of Breast Cancer Over Time, a nonprofit group in San Francisco that's pushing research forward in an innovative and exciting way. You can read more about their group and their amazing and important study at their website, breastcancerovertime.org. You can also find a link to their website, as well as all of our news items and our previous Green Street shows, at our own show website, which is greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for our show today. Special thanks to our guest, Polly Marshall, and all of her associates who contributed to the breast cancer study, and of course to all of you who listen to and support this show. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.